Okay.
Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Okay.
Well, we got some people strolling in yet, and we'll give it another minute or so, and we'll get started. I'd like to thank you ahead of time for scheduling your time to do this with us.
All right.
I'd like to welcome everybody. I teach philosophy and ethics here at Morningside College, and we're pleased to introduce Peter Singer. He is the um, Australian moral philosopher from Princeton, the DeCamp Professor of Bioethics, and Laureate Professor for the Center of Applied Philosophy and Public Ethics at the University of Melbourne. He has various important books: The Life You Can Save, How to Do Your Part in Animal Poverty, and Animal Liberation, definitive classic of the animal movement. One thing I'd like to say personally is that we read your book in this class, like The Life You Can Save, Animal Poverty, because of my conviction that ethics is about doing something good in the world and making the world a better place. And so students here, many of them who have taken your class or are taking class, have raised over $5,000 for organizations like Oxfam to save people's lives. So you've influenced a lot of people here, and we so would like to welcome Peter Singer with a round of applause. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. That actually was quite strange because I could hear you applauding, but for some reason the image is completely frozen. So there you are, all sitting completely still while applauding. That's a good treat. Okay, so it's nice to get a chance to speak to you. It's also nice to know that you have actually been, or students at your college have actually been doing things to raise money for organizations like Oxfam. I think it's really important for people to understand that philosophy makes a difference in the world. You often get people thinking when they don't know anything about philosophy that uh, it's something very abstract, really, up in the clouds. We talk about strange, complicated things, and it has nothing to do with the real world. And that is not true, or at least it's certainly not true of the entire field of philosophy. I'm not going to speak for all of my colleagues. Maybe some of them do things that don't have much to do in the real world. But the cutting edge of philosophy, if you could say, where the rubber hits the road, is, I think, really ethics. Because in ethics, we talk about issues that we can't avoid. I mean, as we go about our lives, we're taking a stance on an ethical issue. Even if we do nothing in the world in which we live, we're clearly taking a stance on an ethical issue, including this issue that I'm talking about with you tonight of global poverty. Um, you're all affluent by world standards. You may say, well, I'm not affluent by American standards, but American standards are extremely affluent by world standards. And if you're earning something like the median US wage, or maybe this doesn't apply to you if you're full-time students, but you think about your parents, something like that. If the median US wage is, I think, around $38,000. That's per person. If you look at the median household income, it's around $50,000. That's enough to put you in the top 3% of the world's population if you're just on that average. So that makes you very wealthy by comparison with most of the world. And especially it makes you extremely wealthy by comparison with the poorest billion or so people in the world. They're the people defined by the World Bank as living in extreme poverty. So let's take a minute to see what living in extreme poverty actually means. The World Bank has a complicated kind of definition, which includes the figure of $1.25 US per day in income. That figure is slightly confusing in two ways. One is that it goes back a few years and needs to be adjusted for inflation. So let's say if you like $2 US per day to make the inflation adjustment. But then if you think about, well, suppose I had $2 and I went to one of these poorer countries and I took that to the bank, or let's say to make it worthwhile, I took 200 US dollars to the bank, and then I had what I got in foreign exchange for that. That might seem, okay, I've now got that equivalent of $200. I could live for 100 days on that, because it's amazing how cheap food is here. It's amazing how cheap accommodation is in this country compared to US standards. But this is where the other adjustment comes in. What the World Bank is talking about is what it calls purchasing power parity. So it's not what you would get for your $2 if you take it to the bank. It's what buys the same in that country as $2 buys in the United States. The same purchasing power as $2 in the United States. And when you think about that, of course, that's very little. And to be able to live on an amount that buys the same as $2 buys in the US, whatever that amount is in the local currency, really means that you have you're barely scraping by. So probably there's times of the year when you don't have food security. That is, you're not sure that you're going to be able to put enough food on the table for yourself or your family so that they can eat just enough calories to keep going. That may be a seasonal thing. You run out of the previous harvest if you're a farmer and you're waiting for the new harvest to come in. There's places where, you know, that's known as the hunger season. You cut down to maybe one meal a day in order to scrape by, or perhaps in some cases you run out altogether. It can happen, although obviously that's rarer. And beyond that, then they just don't have any money for other things. So that if your child falls ill, there's no money to pay for a doctor. If you even have access to a doctor, you might be living in a rural area, you'd have to pay to transport your child to the doctor, and you can't do that either. In some countries, education, even the primary level, is not free, so you may not be able to send your children to school. You're not likely to have safe drinking water, something that Americans take for granted. You may not always like the taste of the water that comes out of the tap. It may have a bit of chlorine in it. You may choose to pay for bottled water, but at least you have safe drinking water. And that's something that 1 billion or so people in the world don't have. And they don't really, of course, have the option of paying for bottled water either. On $2 a day, that would be what they've got their daily income for. So they may have to boil water, in which case they may have to spend a lot of time gathering wood to light the fire, to boil the water. That's time consuming. They are likely not to have sanitation, which means that diseases like diarrhea are going to be much more endemic. And with children who are already weak, perhaps from being malnourished, and with no health care, diarrhea is a significant cause of death in small children in developing countries. Again, it's something that's not really a cause of death in the United States, or extremely rarely, because firstly, there is sanitation, secondly, the water is safer, and thirdly, if a child does get ill with diarrhea and really looks bad, you can take them to hospital and they'll no doubt get some treatment. I'm still not getting any image, by the way, from you. I just want to check, are you hearing me okay? Are you seeing me okay?
Yep.
All right, good. Okay, fine.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, so the image is still frozen. I mean, it's not that I'm not seeing you, but I'm seeing you from some minutes ago. This is like watching a distant star. Um, so okay, so that's the kind of income that we're talking about. Now, now I'm not getting any image at all, but that's all right. Maybe it's coming. Now it's come back. Hi. Okay. Thank you. Good. Good. I can see you moving now. That's a little reassuring. So as I said, that's the difference between our situation and the situation of about 1 billion people in the world. Now, the next question is, well, is that in any way my responsibility? Is that something that concerns me? So this is, I suppose, where the ethics comes in. And as a way of getting a grip on that question, I have for many years, going back to an early article I wrote on this topic, I have invited people to consider a little story, which I'll repeat even if you've already read it. So the story goes that you're walking across a park, and in that park there's a shallow ornamental pond. You know that it's quite shallow because in summer you see kids playing in it, and teenagers, for example, stand up in it. It's waist deep. But now it's not summer, it's winter. There's nobody playing in the pond. In fact, there's nobody in the park at all, it seems, except you walking across the park. But then there is something you notice splashing in the pond. And so you think, what's that? And you look a bit more closely, and you see that it's a small child, a toddler, who's fallen in the pond and is too small to stand up, even in this shallow pond, and seems to be in great danger of drowning. So what's your reaction? Your first reaction is probably to look around and say, well, who's looking after this child? You know, a child that small couldn't be wandering around without a babysitter or parents or someone. But you can't see anybody. There's nobody else except you and the child. So however the child got in the pond, okay, maybe somebody has been negligent, that seems obvious. But however the child got in the pond, it's really now up to you if the child is going to be saved. Otherwise, it looks like the child is going to drown. So your second thought is, well, I better jump into the pond and pull out this child. And you, of course, know there's no danger to you in doing that, but you are going to get cold and wet, and you're going to ruin your fancy pair of shoes that you've put on, let's say the most expensive pair of shoes you own. You don't really have time to try and get them off. The child could well drown in the meantime, just while you're doing that. Every second is vital. So perhaps a not so attractive thought goes through your head that maybe, you know, this child is not your responsibility. You were just walking through the park on your shortcut to go to a class, let's say. Why don't you just continue to go to your class? So imagine that somebody does exactly that somebody thinks that way and says, well, I don't want to ruin my nice shoes. Child's not my responsibility. I'll go on with my class. I'll go on to my class. Would that person be doing something seriously wrong? That's the question that I want you to think about. So since I can see you moving now, let's have a show of hands if you think that somebody who did that would be doing something seriously wrong. How many of you think that? Okay, that looks like pretty much. How is there anybody who doesn't think that? No? There's nobody raising a hand very high anyway. Maybe somebody's scratching their head or something. Okay, so that's actually pretty much the kind of view that I get when I ask this question of my classes, and I've asked it of adult, of other audiences as well, general public sort of audiences. Yeah, people typically think that a person who did that would be doing something quite seriously wrong. In fact, some people have said you'd have to be a monster to weigh up the cost of a pair of shoes against your child, against the child's life. So what that shows is that people do think that at least sometimes we ought to act to save a life, even if we are in no way responsible for that life being in danger. And I think the general feeling that people have here is that that's because the cost to you is really not comparable to the value of what you're gaining. What you're gaining is a child's life. That's something that's extremely important. What you're losing is some amount of money, but not something that's critical to your life, obviously. A bit of discomfort and inconvenience, and that's it. So some people call that the rule of easy rescue. If you can easily rescue somebody, that's what you ought to do. And the question that I then ask, and the reason, of course, that I'm putting this example in this context is that really so different from our situation with regard to the global poor? Because lives are being lost because of extreme poverty. I already mentioned children dying from diarrhea. I could have mentioned children dying from measles because they haven't been immunized against measles. Children dying from malaria because they don't have bed nets to sleep under in malaria-prone regions. There are a lot of children who die from these avoidable poverty-related causes. According to UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Organization, in 2012, 6.6 million children died every year from avoidable poverty-related causes. That figure's a bit hard to grasp. So divided by 365, you get something like 18,000. And now you can grasp that because you can think of a football stadium or something like that that holds 18,000 people. Imagine that filled with children. Imagine you get up in the morning, you turn on the radio, and you read that there's a football stadium full of children and they're all going to die at midnight tonight unless a lot of people come and provide them with some kind of help. Well, I think if that happened, those children would not die. I think if they were there in one spot, the media was focused on them, everybody, and you all too, I'm sure, would feel impelled to contribute something so that these children lived. But because these 18,000 children dying every day are spread all over the world, because they're in rural parts of the developing countries, it's not a news story. The TV cameras can't focus on them. They're not there. They can't predict when a child will die from poverty. It happens one day in one village, another day in another village, but it all adds up. So it just happens, and we don't really know about it unless we particularly go out of our way to look at what's happening at the situation of global poverty and what the outcome of that is, what the consequences of global poverty are. So so that's what you need to think about, and that's what I think is comparable in significant respects with the child in the pond. There are children dying, and we can help them. Now, you can have some debate about how much it costs to save a life. Sometimes the figures, I think, are quoted are misleading. For example, you might hear that it only costs $1 to immunize a child against measles, or that a bed net only costs $5 that protects a child against malaria. But of course, not every bed net or every immunization actually saves a child's life. You may have to immunize hundreds of children in order to statistically save the life of one of them, because they're not all going to get measles, or some of them would have had enough resistance to fight it off. Similarly, you might have to provide hundreds of bed nets to save a child's life, because clearly children have survived in malaria-prone regions. Most of them survive, just some of them don't. So we are definitely talking about much larger sums than that. We're talking about several $100s, perhaps we're even talking about $1,000 to $2,000, but it depends on how you estimate it. In any case, they're not really large amounts by the standards of average Americans. And they do save lives. And in fact, lives are being saved. That 6.6 million figure that I quoted from UNICEF for 2012 is a really bad figure, but it's significantly better than the figure that I quote in my book, The Life You Can Save, which was published in 2009. So I sent the manuscript off to press 2008. And the figure I quote in that book, in the original hardback edition of that book, was 9.9 million. So it had actually been cut by a third between 2008 and 2012. That's very good progress, but it's still obviously too many children to have 6.6 million children dying a year from preventable diseases. So I do think that there are things we can do. I do think that there are things that make a significant difference and that are not going to make such a huge difference to our lives. Again, this is really because of the big differences in income that we have. If somebody is living on $2 a day, then they're earning around $700 a year. If you put some extra money in their pocket, if you put an extra couple of $100 in their pocket, they can now buy things. They may be able to buy more food to get through that hungry time, which make a real difference to their lives. That kind of money doesn't really make any lasting difference to the lives of Americans. It's something that you would spend on things that you would buy without too much thought, maybe not all at once, but certainly over a period of time, you will be buying things that you don't really need, that don't really make a big difference to the quality of your life, that will take that kind of money. So it's that huge discrepancy in purchasing power and the income we have that I think creates a situation in which we have an ethical obligation to do something reasonably significant anyway, not just a few coins in a tin, something reasonably significant for those people who, through no fault of their own, are in extreme poverty and who are suffering all of the consequences of that, which perhaps the most dramatic is that they may have to watch their children die from diseases that our children don't get, or that are easily treatable if our children do get them. But that's only one of the many things, the many hardships, the many humiliations, the many indignities that people in extreme poverty often have to suffer. So that's really the core of the argument that I want to put to you. And I'd like to hear from you. I'm sure you've got a number of different questions that you would like to ask, or comments, or things that you think perhaps are wrong with this argument. And I think it'd be good if we spent the rest of our time addressing some of those concerns that you may have.
Questions? We got one over there. Go ahead.
Okay, that's a very good question. There are a number of websites now that make recommendations about charities, and there's one of them that's only been going about 6 years, but I think is setting a new standard for the rigor of its analysis. It's called GiveWell, so if you just put in givewell.org, it'll pop up. And actually what you see when you go to that homepage is you see a pie chart which has charities reviewed, that's the pie chart, and charities recommended, which is a tiny slice of the charities reviewed. And that shows you how rigorous they are. In fact, a lot of people in the philanthropy field think that they're too rigorous and are a bit upset by them because their organizations don't get rated positively. Now, that doesn't mean that they're bad organizations. What it means is that GiveWell feels it can't be sufficiently confident about their high level of effectiveness to recommend them. So GiveWell isn't saying that all the other organizations are not doing a good job. They're just saying we're only going to recommend organizations that are really completely transparent in what they do with your money, and where we can see where the dollars go, and we can track that your dollars are going to have a very, very high impact. And that's why some of the well-known organizations, including organizations that I think are really good, we mentioned Oxfam at the beginning. I donate to Oxfam, and I do think they're a good organization, but they're a large organization, and that makes it difficult to track all of the different programs that they operate. So GiveWell doesn't actually give them a rating. What it does is focus generally on smaller and narrower organizations. So I mentioned giving bed nets against malaria. So that's their top rating organization at the moment. It's called the Against Malaria Foundation. It's an organization that does nothing but distribute bed nets to families in malaria-prone regions. Or, well, I shouldn't actually say it does nothing but that, because the other thing it does, and the thing that is absolutely essential for GiveWell to rate it, is it does follow-up studies on what happens to those bed nets and what happens to the children in those families. And it does these follow-ups comparing the villages that it's reached and that it's gone to with bed nets with the villages, with similar villages that it hasn't gone to, because it just doesn't have the capacity to go to all of the villages anyway. So it can really therefore produce solid evidence, statistically significant evidence, that the bed nets are saving lives, and it can calculate roughly, how much it takes to save a life. So that's their top rating charity, and I think if your interest is in saving the lives of children in developing countries, malaria is a major killer, and that's an excellent organization to give to. There are a couple of other organizations that GiveWell rates. I'll also mention a couple of other websites. One of them is one that I've had a role in setting up. It's got the same name as the title of the book I wrote, and it was originally set up in conjunction with the book. So it's called The Life You Can Save, thelifeyoucansave.org. And it has a recommendation page as well. It does recommend the organizations that GiveWell recommends, but it's somewhat more flexible, somewhat looser, and it recommends others that I have good reason to think are effective. And the third website that I'll mention is a British organization called Giving What We Can, which is doing something similar, and you might like to have a look at that and its recommendations as well.
Other questions? Yes.
Yeah, and in fact, the figures were from 9.9 million to 6.6 million. So that's the 3.3 maybe that you got in your head was the difference that's been made. It has dropped by 3.3 million over those for roughly 4 years, which is good progress. Now, certainly some of it is because of the aid programs. I think there's no doubt. I have a colleague here called Angus Deaton, a professor of economics who studies health programs in developing world, and he's skeptical about some aid programs, but he thinks that some of these programs, international programs relating to healthcare, have saved large numbers of lives. So yes, not just children, I should say. He's, for example, the program that was set up for treating people with HIV/AIDS, set up under George W. Bush's presidency and still continuing, has undoubtedly saved millions of lives by making antiretroviral drugs more readily available, and also by carrying out educational campaigns about how to avoid HIV/AIDS. So those things have definitely saved millions of lives. I don't think anyone seriously disagrees with that. But there's no doubt that economic progress saves lives as well. Economic progress, and you mentioned infrastructure and things like that, which is part of that, does save lives by giving people more income, getting their children a better nourished, therefore, they're more able to resist diseases. They can get some health care then. So the fact that countries like, I guess China would be the best example, have made significant economic progress in recent years, and therefore have pulled many, many millions of people out of extreme poverty. So that would certainly also have contributed to the reduced number of deaths. So there's not just one cause, but it's noticeable that even in countries that haven't made economic progress, the number of deaths has been falling because of the aid programs.
Others?
Yeah, I think that's a perfectly reasonable question. I do think we have to look at the long term, not only at the present. I mean, obviously, if there's, that's one difference, if you like, about the child in the pond example. If you're just thinking about the present and this particular child in front of you right now. And I do think that when we think ethically, we have to think about the longer term consequences as well. So when we shift to the global perspective, it's reasonable to ask these questions of the kind that you're asking. But in fact, I think, though, there's the appearance of a conflict. There isn't really that much of a conflict here. I do think that the planet has some limit to the carrying capacity. Most of the population experts say population is rising, although the rate at which it's rising is not as fast as it was globally. More countries are starting to get to a more or less stable population, but there are still a lot of countries where the population is growing. And they tend to be the poorer countries, which is a real problem. So does, I mean, this would put it very crudely, and I don't want to put these words in your mouth as if you were saying this, but, people might think, well, does saving these children's lives mean that there are going to be more children around and therefore they're going to have more children themselves, and the result is, in the end, we'll get overpopulated and we'll have a worse, bigger catastrophe? I don't think it does, because there's a lot of evidence that when people manage to escape poverty, other things happen too. So one of the things that happens is more of their children survive and they have fewer children. In a lot of cultures where parents would watch their children die, would watch several of their children die, they would have large families, because for them it was vital that they have surviving children who will help them in their old age. They don't have social security programs that will enable them to have enough to eat in their old age. They need to have children who will help them. And if their children are going to die, they need to have lots of children so some survive. But if they see that their children are surviving, then their fertility rate drops. Another factor is, as people get out of extreme poverty, they educate their children. And education has been shown to relate to fertility. I should say inversely relate to fertility. So essentially, the more years of education you have, and this applies particularly to girls, but the more years of education that you have, the fewer children you're likely to have over your lifetime. So providing education for children, especially where, or as long as where the girls are partaking in that education as well, can be a critical way of helping people to get out of poverty themselves, and helping them also to space their births therefore you have fewer children, and population gets under control, and the children are all individually healthier as well, because it stands to reason that if a couple have to feed, let's say 4 children under 6, which is not unusual with high rates of fertility, then each of those children is going to get much less attention than if they have 2 children under 6, for instance. So those sorts of things can make a difference, and I think it is worth thinking about those things and thinking about how best to direct our aid so that we don't contribute to a kind of, well, you put it in terms of carrying capacity, to a world in which the population just grows beyond the point at which it can support a decent life for the population, or conceivably even leads to the extinction of our species. Although I think for population growth to lead to the extinction of our species, a lot of other things would have to go wrong as well. Yes, there was a bit of static, but you're asking about the Millennium Villages project, is that correct? Yeah, right. You're right. Some information has come out about that quite recently. There's been some criticism of Jeff Sachs in particular. And I have to say, I'm somewhat disappointed in the lack of rigorous testing that the Millennium Villages project has done or haven't done. So I mentioned before that the Against Malaria Foundation, for instance, to check that its bed nets are working, looks not only at the villages where it's distributing bed nets, but at comparable villages where it's not distributing bed nets, to get a baseline which it can judge what kind of progress is made. The Millennium Villages project has not done that. And I think that that is a real pity, because I think it means that it's really difficult to know what difference the project is making. In some of the areas, the Millennium Villages project themselves have put out information saying there's lots of indicators that show that people are better off, that they're better fed, that they're growing more food, that they have better health, and things of that sort. But other people have pointed out that in the regions in which these villages are, I think not in every country, but in some of them, the whole region has made economic progress, which is, of course, a good thing. But it does mean that we don't know that the Millennium Villages project itself has really made the difference in those villages in which it's been located. So, yeah, I think if I were rewriting the book now, I would not be as positive about the Millennium Villages project as I was at that time.
Would you be able to explain what the Millennium Village project was? We do have some people who aren't in the ethics class.
Okay, sure. The idea. So as you may know, the world back in 2000, that's the Millennium reference. In the year 2000, set these things called the Millennium Development Goals. They were signed onto. There was a big United Nations meeting in New York. The heads of almost every country in the world came over. They signed on to this, and in particular, the wealthier nations agreed to give significant amounts of aid in order to reach something called the Millennium Development Goals, which included things like halving the number of people who are not getting enough to eat, providing, I can't remember, providing sanitation to a certain percentage of people who didn't have it, and providing education. I think universal primary education was the goal. There were a number of different goals that were signed onto. And some people said, well, these goals seem a bit, the target date was 2015, which is, of course, now very close. But some people said right back in 2000 or soon after, we're not going to be able to reach these goals because there's no way we can bring these kinds of changes, particularly to rural parts of developing countries to rural villages in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, or in India. And Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who is a professor now at Columbia University, but who at the time was a special assistant to Kofi Annan, then the Secretary General of the United Nations, said, look, it can be done, but you need a multi-pronged approach. So it's not enough, for example, just to provide healthcare. You have to provide fertilizer for poor farmers so they can grow better crops. And you have to provide some education. A variety of different things has to all be fed in at the same time, and then you can make a difference. And his idea was that, in particular, say with agriculture, farmers were always in debt. They were having to borrow to buy seed and stuff like that. And so they didn't really have the money to buy fertilizer, and they didn't therefore get decent crops, and they didn't therefore get any cash to buy fertilizer because they only got enough food to feed their families, not to sell on the market. So his idea was, we'll provide fertilizer for a limited number of years, and then they'll have better crops, and then they'll have cash, then they'll be able to sell part of their crops, and they'll have cash, and then they'll be able to buy the fertilizer themselves, which they'll do because they've seen how effective it is in producing better crops and more money. So that was the idea. And so he selected different villages in lots of regions around the world and had this sort of multi-pronged approach. And as I say, it seemed to work. Certainly the villages did have better crops and seemed to get better in a number of other indicators. But then these critics have come up and said, well, we don't know that it's because of the aid rather than because of other factors that happened in the intervening years. So I think Sachs originally was trying to sort of prove a thesis that with a reasonable amount of input, but not spending huge amounts of money. You know, he was basically trying to show that we could solve extreme poverty with a modest increase. I think his figures were something like 150 to 200 billion dollars a year extra in aid. So just to give you a handle on that, and this is from the world as a whole, not just from the US, but to give you a handle on that, what's US military spending is now something like $600 billion, is it? So for about a third of what the US alone spends on its military, Sachs's idea was that the world would be able to eliminate at least most of extreme poverty. And I think the result, you'd have to say, is that he hasn't really demonstrated this. He certainly hasn't demonstrated it with the kind of rigor that would be needed to convince the guys who work for GiveWell or even me, really, that that this approach does make the kind of difference that he's suggesting it does.
Other questions? Yep.
Yeah, right. There will be one person at the bottom who's had the least. I'm not arguing for equality. I think equality, you know, real equality of income and wealth, I'm talking about. Political equality is a different matter. We can have that. But real equality of income and wealth, I don't think is possible, you know, outside of some rigidly authoritarian system that controls everything you do and spend on, and I don't think any of us want that. But I've been talking about extreme poverty, right? I've been talking about what the World Bank defines as extreme poverty. I haven't been talking about relative poverty. So relative poverty, for example, exists everywhere. I'm sure if you were all prepared to state what your income or what your family's income is, and you lined up with the person with the highest income at one end of the classroom and the person with the lowest income at the other, there would be a significant gap between the top and the bottom, and there would be somebody at the bottom. But that person at the bottom, I'm also prepared to bet, will have way above that World Bank poverty line of, as I say, roughly the purchasing power equivalent of $2 US a day. That's a level of poverty that really doesn't exist in the United States. Even, I mean, okay, so maybe there are some people who are completely homeless and have no income at all, but they at least they have a right, if they can, only get themselves together enough to get to it. They have a right to food stamps. They have access to safe drinking water. If they're seriously ill and they turn up in the emergency room of a hospital, they will get treated. The hospital's not allowed to turn them away, just even if they got no health insurance at all. So they are much better off than people in extreme poverty. And what I do think, when people say the poor will always be with us, I would say it's not at all inevitable that the extreme poor will always be with us, that people in extreme poverty will be with us. And I'd be much more satisfied with a world in which, sure, some people were poorer than others, but all of them had enough to eat, had enough to feed their families, had basic health care, had safe drinking water, had sanitation, could send their children to school. All of that would make a huge difference. And that's really what I am urging that we ought to be able to eliminate.
Other questions? Referring back to the Millennium Village, just in general principle, do you think one is better than the other? One giving money to a charity that's just basically going to provide food, or giving money to a charity that instead will educate? Do you think there's a better choice to be made there?
Yeah, I'm not generally in favor of giving food. I think that is likely to create dependence, and it's also likely to distort markets. I'm not saying you should never give food. I mean, obviously, there can be cases, you see these horrible footage of a famine that's happening somewhere in the world, and these really emaciated children. And clearly, in those circumstances, you have to give food, otherwise large numbers of people are going to die. But it shouldn't be a general strategy of aid to give food. It should be, because it's what we really want to do is to help people to produce their own food, and particularly when a lot of US aid is involved in shipping grain from the US to developing countries, and that really exists, I think, because politically it has a lot of support, because the grain growers and the shipping companies have a financial interest in this. It means that grain growers get to sell their grains, the shippers get to profit from the shipping charges. But if you then deliver all this US grain in developing countries, sure, it does mean that grain is cheap and people get to eat, but it means that the farmers who wanted to sell their grain in the market can no longer get a price they can live on for it, because it's competing with this free US grain. So I think that should only be for really extreme emergencies. I don't think it should be a regular form of aid. We should create an economic structure that gives incentives to farmers to grow more grain and produce grain, because that's really what's going to be more sustainable in the long run and is going to help the local economies. Okay, well, I've been quite public about what I give. I give about a third of my income. That's a lot by most people's standards, but I'm not particularly proud of it, because as a professor at Princeton, I have a good income, and that still leaves me certainly well above the average US income. So I could give more, I acknowledge. I think it's something like, in a way, I've got into habits and commitments to some extent that mean that I'm not giving everything that I could be giving. I have been, I am giving more as I'm cutting down on some of those commitments, and able to give more. And I certainly want to work up towards 50% over the next few years. And I do know a number of people who are giving that, and I think it's certainly possible to do that. So that's the question about how much I'm giving. Sorry, there was a second half of your question, which has now slipped my mind. What got me interested in it. I got interested in this, at the time, for those of you who did read the article, the original article, which I talked about the drowning child in the pond. It's called Famine, Affluence and Morality. It's written sort of a lifetime ago, really. It was written in 1972 when I was a graduate student at the University of Oxford. And that was a time when the country that is now Bangladesh had been part of Pakistan. It had been called East Pakistan. It was geographically separated by a large part of India, but they'd been sort of artificially constructed, the country of Pakistan, at the creation of Indian independence at the end of British colonial rule. And the people of what was then East Pakistan wanted more autonomy. They weren't actually asking for independence, but they wanted more autonomy from West Pakistan, which was the other part of the country. And most of the army were people from West Pakistan. So the Pakistani army brutally repressed this independence movement, killed a lot of East Pakistanis, and drove 9 million people across the Indian border. So there were 9 million people in refugee camps across the Indian border. And India was then a much poorer country than it is today. It was not possible for India really to feed these 9 million people. And so there were appeals to the rest of the world to do something about it. And I realized that, here was I certainly wasn't wealthy as I was a graduate student. I was married, and my wife was a high school teacher, so she was earning a bit of money. We were not well off, but we thought, well, we can give to this. We should give. Why aren't people giving? Because there are these 9 million people in real need of some help. And it was in that context that I started giving. Oxford, as it happens, is the birthplace of the international organization Oxfam. That's where the word comes from, Oxford Famine Relief Committee, which is what it was originally. And so we went to the headquarters of Oxfam. We were quite near where we were living, and we talked to them about what they were doing, and we were satisfied that what they were doing was effective and useful, and we started donating to them. And then, because I was a philosophy graduate student, I started thinking about, well, what's the ethics of this? And it's interesting that at that time, really, nobody much was writing about this. I mean, there were some people, religious leaders, who were talking about it, to their credit. That's good. But in the field of philosophy, writing about it in a sort of a more secular way, there was really nobody doing that. And I think that's why that article got so well known, because it was, pretty much the first out there to really discuss this question.
Yeah.
I think the answer is, look, it's a big, complicated question, but the simple answer is we don't have to work through governments. And that's not what the effective organizations do. They don't just give money to governments. In fact, they don't give money to governments at all, usually. So the Against Malaria Fund, for example, will go to villages, and it will talk to people in the village council or whatever it is, or it will work with a local, perhaps regional organization that will help it to distribute the bed nets. But it won't just go to the government and say, here's $1 million, please buy bed nets for it. It will go there itself. It will take the bed nets, it will distribute them, or it will distribute them with local grassroots representatives. And so even in countries that don't have good governments, you can do that. And there's not really, there's not much opportunity for corruption for the government to do that. I mean, the government isn't going to bother trying to steal the bed nets off people and resell them. That's not going to be a very interesting financial proposition to them. So generally, non-government organizations, the charities in this country, will try to avoid working through governments, and of course, especially in countries where the governments are either incompetent or corrupt, and there are some countries like that. Now, there might be some countries that you feel you just can't work in. There might be some countries the governments are so repressive that they just take whatever people have, or perhaps there's a civil war going on. There might be places where it's too dangerous for aid workers to work. That's certainly possible. But in most of the countries of the world, it is possible for non-government organizations to work directly. And that's one of the reasons, I think, why why non-government organizations tend to be more cost-effective than government aid. So some people ask, why don't I just advocate more government aid rather than suggesting that individuals give privately? Because there's some advantages to government aid. Obviously, it comes out of tax revenue, and that means that everybody contributes their share. And those who have more, the wealthy, get taxed at a higher rate, so they contribute a larger share, and that seems fair. So that aspect of it is good. But the fact that government aid is politically influenced and tends to go to governments that we want to support, like a lot of US aid goes to Afghanistan and Iraq and Egypt, really because of the political interest we have in supporting those regimes, that means that it's less effective, much less effective than these non-government organizations. So I think there's a good reason for saying that it's better if we give individually than if government aid increases, unless that is we could really reform government aid and make it really help the poor.
We got time for one more question. If anybody's got one last question. Yeah.
What's the feasibility
Okay, so as you may know, there was a big debt relief movement that also focused on the Millennium. I guess the traditional biblical idea that you had every 50 years you had a jubilee, which you forgave debts, and I think that was carried through to the Millennium idea. So there was a lot of debt relief. I think that I think probably the debt relief did help some governments which were under a severe burden of debt, but it's clearly not something that you can do repeatedly, right? I mean, because these governments do want to borrow. It's reasonable for governments to borrow in order to finance infrastructure projects. Just as our government borrows by issuing treasury notes and so on. A government can't expect to borrow if then it's going to turn around in 5 or 10 years and say, "Hey, I want you to forgive my debts. Why don't we have debt relief? Debt is oppressive." Then nobody is going to lend to those governments, and there's no incentive for the government to be responsible with that money. So I think that we had this in 2000, and I don't really think we can particularly repeat it. I mean, there are some special cases, I guess, where really bad, corrupt governments incurred ridiculous debts, which were of no benefit to the people. Maybe they built a huge palace for the president, or they invested in the military or something like that. And now we've had, there's been a change, and now we have a democratic government that is really trying to do something for the people. But it's crippled by a burden of debt incurred by the previous regime. I think in those circumstances, yes, debt relief makes a lot of sense and can help. But I don't see it as a general, useful, continuing principle. I think we need to encourage governments to be responsible with what they borrow, and they're only going to be responsible if they will have the reasonable expectation that they're going to have to repay what they borrow, and therefore they have to use it wisely so that their economy grows and they can repay it.
Very good. Well, I'd like to thank you for taking your time and answer our questions and talk with us today. It was a great honor to have you here. Let's give Professor Singer a round of applause.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And it's been good to talk to you. I've enjoyed listening to your questions and replying, and I hope that many of you will continue to do excellent work in raising money, whether for Oxfam or for one of the other charities that I've been talking about. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Bye.
So cool.
No problem. Thank you for coming. So